Oh, hello there. Today, we are reading an essay from Susan Sontag's on photography. I am revisiting a lot of Susan Sontag's work, which I read in college, because I'm doing a lot of writing around the impact of photos on our phones and social media and TikTok and videos on memory, and also with some analysis about race. So I wanted to return to Susan Sontag because she writes about photography and its impact on society and people. This is going to be a very philosophical reading. If you are someone who is interested in photographs, in how social media is affecting our minds and history, if you're interested in time as a concept, filmmaking, then I recommend listening to this read aloud. If you want something more fun, go to the other read alouds or the vlogs. And what really blows my mind about Sontag is that she was writing about photography and the impact of person to person photographing in the 70s. She was so prescient, and the issues she's saying that it's going to have on our minds and our culture and our society. It's how could she have foreseen Instagram and TikTok and how photo obsessed our society would be? She's a genius. And there are a lot of criticisms of Sontag, and maybe I'll get into those at another time. But for now, let's get into In Plato's Cave. Humankind lingers unregenerately in Plato's cave, still reveling its age-old habit in mere images of the truth. But being educated by photographs is not like being educated by older, more artisanal images. For one thing, there are a great many more images around claiming our attention. The inventory started in 1839, and since then just about everything has been photographed, or so it seems. This very insatiability of the photographing eye changes the terms of confinement in the cave, our world. In teaching us a new visual code, photographs alter and enlarge our notions of what is worth looking at and what we have a right to observe. They are a grammar, and even more importantly, an ethics of seeing. Finally, the most grandiose result of the photographic enterprise is to give us the sense that we can hold the whole world in our heads, as an anthology of images. To collect photographs is to collect the world. Movies and television programs light up walls, flicker, and go out. But with still photographs, the image is also an object. Lightweight, cheap to produce, easy to carry about, accumulate, store. In Godard's Les Carabiniers, 1963, two sluggish lumpen peasants are lured into joining the king's army by the promise that they will be able to loot, rape, kill, or do whatever else they please to the enemy and get rich. But the suitcase of booty that Michel-Ange and Ulysses triumphantly bring home years later to their wives turns out to contain only picture postcards, hundreds of them. The monuments, department stores, mammals, wonders of nature, methods of transport, works of art, and other classified treasures from around the globe. Godard's gag vividly parodies the equivocal magic of the photographic image. Photographs are perhaps the most mysterious of all the objects that make up and thicken the environment we recognize as modern. Photographs really are experience captured, and the camera is the ideal arm of consciousness in its acquisitive mood. To photograph is to appropriate the thing photographed. It means putting oneself into a certain relation to the world that feels like knowledge and therefore like power. A now notorious first fall into alienation, habituating people to abstract the world into printed words, is supposed to have engendered that surplus of Faustian energy and psychic damage needed to build modern, inorganic societies. But print seems a less treacherous form of leaching out the world, of turning it into a mental object, than photographic images, which now provide most of the knowledge people have about the look of the past and the reach of the present. What is written about a person or an event is frankly an interpretation, as are handmade visual statements like paintings and drawings. Photographed images do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it, miniatures of reality that anyone can make or acquire. Photographs, which fiddle with the scale of the world, themselves get reduced, blown up, cropped, retouched, doctored, tricked out. They age, plagued by the usual ills of paper objects. They disappear, they become valuable, and get bought and sold, they are reproduced. Photographs, which package the world, seem to invite packaging. They are stuck in albums, framed and set on tables, tacked on walls, projected as slides. Newspapers and magazines feature them, cops alphabetize them, museums exhibit them, publishers compile them. For many decades, the book has been the most influential way of arranging, and usually miniaturizing, photographs, thereby guaranteeing them longevity, if not immortality. Photographs are fragile objects, easily torn or mislaid, and a wider public. The photograph in a book is obviously the image of an image. But since it is, to begin with, a printed, smooth object, a photograph loses much less of its essential quality when reproduced in a book than a painting does. Still, the book is not a wholly satisfactory scheme for putting groups of photographs into general circulation. The sequence in which the photographs are to be looked at is proposed by the order of pages, but nothing holds readers to the recommended order or indicates the amount of time to be spent on each photograph. Chris Marker's film Si j'avais quatre dromadaires, 1966, a brilliantly orchestrated meditation on photographs of all sorts and themes, suggests a subtler and more rigorous way of packaging and enlarging still photographs. Both the order and the exact time for looking at each photograph are imposed, and there is a gain in visual legibility and emotional impact. But photographs transcribed in a film cease to be collectible objects, as they are still when served up in books. Photographs furnish evidence, something we hear about, but doubt seems proven when we're shown a photograph of it. In one version of its utility, the camera record incriminates, starting with their use by the Paris police in the murderous roundup of communards in June 1871. Photographs became a useful tool of modern states in the surveillance and control of their increasingly mobile populations. In another version of its utility, the camera record justifies. A photograph passes for the incontrovertible proof that a given thing happened. The picture may distort, but there is always a presumption that something exists, or did exist, which is like what's in the picture. Whatever the limitations, through amateurism or pretensions, through artistry, of the individual photographer, a photograph, any photograph, seems to have a more innocent and therefore more accurate relation to visible reality than do other mimetic objects. Virtuosi of the noble image, like Alfred Stieglitz and Paul Strand, composing mighty, unforgettable photographs decade after decade, still want, first of all, to show something out there, just like the Polaroid owner for whom photographs are a handy, fast form of note-taking, or the shutterbug with a brownie who takes snapshots as souvenirs of daily life. While a painting or a prose description can never be other than a narrowly selective interpretation, a photograph can be treated as a narrowly selective transparency. But despite the presumption of veracity that gives all photographs authority, interest, seductiveness, the work that photographers do is no generic exception to the usually shady commerce between art and truth. Even when photographers are most concerned with mirroring reality, they are still haunted by tacit imperatives of taste and conscience. The immensely gifted members of the Farm Security Administration photographic project of the late 1930s, among them Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Ben Shahn, Russell Lee, would take dozens of frontal pictures of one of their sharecropper subjects until satisfied that they had gotten just the right look on film. The precise expression on the subject's face that supported their own notions about poverty, light, dignity, texture, exploitation, and geometry. In deciding how a picture should look, in preferring one exposure to another, photographers are always imposing standards on their subjects. Although there is a sense in which the camera does indeed capture reality, not just interpret it, photographs are as much an interpretation of the world as paintings and drawings. Those occasions when the taking of photographs is relatively undiscriminating, promiscuous, or self-effacing do not lessen the didacticism of the whole enterprise. This very passivity and ubiquity of the photographic record is photography's message, its aggression. Images which idealize, like most fashion and animal photography, are no less aggressive than work which makes a virtue of plainness, like class pictures, still lifes of the bleaker sort, and mugshots. There is an aggression implicitly in every use of the camera. This is as evident in the 1840s and 1850s, photography's glorious first 2 decades, as in all the succeeding decades, during which technology made possible an ever-increasing spread of that mentality which looks at the world as a set of potential photographs. Even for such early masters as David Octavius Hill and Julia Margaret Cameron, who used the camera as a means of getting painterly images, the point of taking photographs was a vast departure from the aims of painters. From its start, photography implied the capture of the largest possible number of subjects. Painting never had so imperial a scope. The subsequent industrialization of camera technology only carried out a promise inherent in photography from its very beginning, to democratize all experiences by translating them into images. That age when taking photographs required a cumbersome and expensive contraption, the toy of the clever, the wealthy, and the obsessed, seemed remote, indeed, from the era of sleek pocket cameras that invite anyone to take pictures. The first cameras, made in France and England in the early 1840s, had only inventors and buffs to operate them. Since there were no professional photographers, there could not be amateurs either, and taking photographs had no clear social use. It was a gratuitous, that is, an artistic activity, though with few pretensions to being an art. It was only with its industrialization that photography came as its own art. As industrialization provided social uses for the operations of the photographer, so the reaction against these uses reinforced the self-consciousness of photography as art. Recently, photography has become almost as widely practiced an amusement as sex and dancing, which means that, like every mass art form, photography is not practiced by most people as an art. It is mainly a social right, a defense against anxiety, and a tool of power. Memorializing the achievements of individuals considered as members of families, as well as of other groups, is the earliest popular use of photography. For at least a century, the wedding photograph has been as much a part of the ceremony as the prescribed verbal formulas. Cameras go with family life. According to a sociological study done in France, most households have a camera. But a household with children is twice as likely to have at least one camera as a household in which there are no children. Not to take pictures of one's children, particularly when they are small, is a sign of parental indifference, just as not turning up for one's graduation picture is a gesture of adolescent rebellion. Through photographs, each family constructs a portrait chronicle of itself, a portable kit of images that bears witness to its connectedness. It hardly matters what activities are photographed, so long as photographs get taken and are cherished. Photography becomes a rite of family life, just when, in the industrializing countries of Europe and America, the very institution of the family starts undergoing radical surgery. As that claustrophobic unit, the nuclear family, was being carved out of a much larger family aggregate, photography came along to memorialize, to restate symbolically, the imperiled continuity and vanishing extendedness of family life. Those ghostly traces, photographs, supply the token presence of the dispersed relatives. A family's photograph album is generally about the extended family, and often is all that remains of it. As photographs give people an imaginary possession of a past that is unreal, they also help people to take possession of space in which they are insecure. Ooh! Thus, photography develops in tandem with one of the most characteristic of modern activities, tourism. For the first time in history, large numbers of people regularly travel out of their habitual environments for short periods of time. It seems positively unnatural to travel for pleasure without taking a camera along. Photographs will offer indisputable evidence that the trip was made, that the program was carried out, that fun was had. Photographs document sequences of consumption carried on outside the view of family, friends, and neighbors. But dependence on the camera, as the device that makes real what one is experiencing, doesn't fade when people travel more. Taking photographs fills the same need for the cosmopolitans accumulating photograph trophies of their boat trip up the Albert Nile or their 14 days in China, as it does for lower middle-class vacationers taking snapshots of the Eiffel Tower or Niagara Falls. A way of certifying experience, taking photographs is also a way of refusing it. By limiting experience to a search for the photogenic, by converting experience into an image, a souvenir. Travel becomes a strategy for accumulating photographs. The very activity of taking pictures is soothing and assuages general feelings of disorientation that are likely to be exacerbated by travel. Most tourists feel compelled to put the camera between themselves and whatever is remarkable that they encounter. Unsure of other responses, they take a picture. This gives shape to experience. Stop, take a photograph, and move on. The method especially appeals to people handicapped by a ruthless work ethic. Germans, Japanese, and Americans. Using a camera appeases the anxiety which the work-driven feel about not working when they are on vacation and supposed to be having fun. They have something to do that is like a friendly imitation of work. They can take pictures. People robbed of their past seem to make the most fervent picture takers, at home and abroad. Everyone who lives in an industrialized society is obliged, gradually, to give up the past. But in certain countries, such as the United States and Japan, the break with the past has been particularly traumatic. In the early 1970s, the fable of the brash American tourist of the 1950s and 60s rich with dollars and babbitry, was replaced by the mystery of the group-minded Japanese tourist, newly released from his island prison by the miracle of the overvalued yen, who is generally armed with 2 cameras, one on each hip. Photography has become one of the principal devices for experiencing something, for giving an appearance of participation. One full-page ad shows a small group of people standing pressed together, peering out of the photograph, all but one looking stunned, excited, upset. The one who wears a different expression holds a camera to his eye. He seems self-possessed, almost smiling. While the others are passive, clearly alarmed spectators, having a camera has transformed one person into something active, voyeur. Only he has mastered the situation. What do these people see? We don't know, and it doesn't matter. It is an event, capital E. Something worth seeing, and therefore worth photographing. The ad copy, white letters across the dark lower third of the photograph, like news coming over a teletype machine, consists of just 6 words: Prague, Woodstock, Vietnam, Sapporo, Londonderry, Leica. Crushed hopes, youth antics, colonial wars, and winter sports are equalized by the camera. Taking photographs has set up a chronic voyeuristic relation to the world which levels the meaning of all events. A photograph is not just the result of an encounter between an event and a photographer. Picture-taking is an event in itself, and one with ever more peremptory rights, to interfere with, to invade, or to ignore whatever is going on. Our very sense of situation is now articulated by the camera's interventions. The omnipresence of cameras persuasively suggests that time consists of interesting events worth photographing. This, in turn, makes it easy to feel that any event, once underway, and whatever its moral character, should be allowed to complete itself, so that something else can be brought into the world, the photograph. After the event has ended, the picture will still exist, conferring on the event a kind of immortality and importance it would never otherwise have enjoyed. While real people are out there killing themselves or other real people, the photographer stays behind his or her camera, creating a tiny element of another world, the image world that bids to outlast us all. Photographing is essentially an act of non-intervention. Part of the horror of such memorable coups of contemporary photojournalism as the pictures of a Vietnamese bonze reaching for the gasoline can, of a Bengali guerrilla in the act of bayoneting a trussed-up collaborator, comes from the awareness of how plausible it has become, in situations where the photographer has the choice between a photograph and a life, to choose the photograph. The person who intervenes cannot record. The person who is recording cannot intervene. Dziga Vertov's great film, Man with a Movie Camera, 1927, gives the ideal image of the photographer as someone in perpetual movement, someone moving through a panorama of disparate events with such agility and speed that any intervention is out of the question. Hitchcock's Rear Window, 1954, gives the complementary image. The photographer, played by James Stewart, has an intensified relation to one event through his camera, precisely because he has a broken leg and is confined to a wheelchair. Being temporarily immobilized prevents him from acting on what he sees, and makes it even more important to take pictures. Even if incompatible with intervention in a physical sense, using a camera is still a form of participation. Although the camera is an observation station, the act of photographing is more than passive observing. Like sexual voyeurism, it is a way of at least tacitly, often explicitly, encouraging whatever is going on to keep on happening. To take a picture is to have an interest in things as they are, in the status quo remaining unchanged, at least for as long as it takes to get a good picture. To be in complicity with whatever makes a subject interesting, worth photographing, including, when that is the interest, another person's pain or misfortune. I always thought of photography as a naughty thing to do. That was one of my favorite things about it, Diane Arbus wrote. And when I first did it, I felt very perverse. Being a professional photographer can be thought of as naughty, to use Arbus's pop word, if the photographer seeks out subjects considered to be disreputable, taboo, marginal. But naughty subjects are harder to find these days. And what exactly is the perverse aspect of picture taking? If professional photographers often have sexual fantasies when they are behind the camera, perhaps the perversion lies in the fact that these fantasies are both plausible and so inappropriate. In Blow Up, 1966, Antonioni has the fashion photographer hovering convulsively over Verushka's body with his camera clicking. Naughtiness indeed. In fact, using a camera is not a very good way of getting at someone sexually. Between photographer and subject, there has to be distance. The camera doesn't rape or even possess, though it may presume, intrude, trespass, distort, exploit, and at the farthest reach of metaphor, assassinate all activities that, unlike the sexual push and shove, can be conducted from a distance and with some detachment. There is a much stronger sexual fantasy in Michael Powell's extraordinary movie Peeping Tom, 1960, which is not about a peeping Tom, but about a psychopath who kills women with a weapon concealed in his camera while photographing them. Not once does he touch his subjects. He doesn't desire their bodies, he wants their presence in the form of filmed images, those showing them experiencing their own death, which he screens at home for his solitary pleasure. The movie assumes connections between impotence and aggression, professionalized looking and cruelty, which point to the central fantasy connected with the camera. The camera as phallus is, at most, the flimsy variant of the inescapable metaphor that everyone unselfconsciously employs. However hazy our awareness of this fantasy, it is named without subtlety whenever we talk about loading and aiming a camera, about shooting a film. The old-fashioned camera was clumsier and harder to reload than a brown Bess musket. The modern camera is trying to be a ray gun. One ad reads, "The Yashica Electro 35 GT is the space-age camera your family will love. Take beautiful pictures day or night, automatically, without any nonsense. Just aim, focus, and shoot. The GT's computer brain and electronic shutter will do the rest." Like a car, a camera is sold as a predatory weapon, one that's automated as possible, ready to spring. Popular taste expects an easy, an invisible technology. Manufacturers reassure their customers that taking pictures demands no skill or expert knowledge, that the machine is all-knowing and responds to the slightest pressure of the will. It's as simple as turning the ignition key or pulling the trigger. Like guns and cars, cameras are fantasy machines whose use is addictive. However, despite the extravagances of ordinary language and advertising, they are not lethal. In the hyperbole that markets cars like guns, there is at least this much truth. Except in wartime, cars kill more people than guns do. The camera gun does not kill, so the ominous metaphor seems to be all bluff, like a man's fantasy of having a gun, knife, or tool between his legs. Still, there is something predatory in the act of taking a picture. To photograph people is to violate them, by seeing them as they never see themselves, by having knowledge of them as they can never have. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. Just as the camera is a sublimation of the gun, to photograph someone is a sublimated murder, a soft murder, appropriate to a sad, frightened time. Eventually, people might learn to act out more of their aggressions with cameras and fewer with guns, with the price being an even more image-choked world. One situation where people are switching from bullets to film is the photographic safari that is replacing the gun safari in East Africa. The hunters have Hasselblads instead of Winchesters. Instead of looking through a telescopic sight to aim a rifle, they look through a viewfinder to frame a picture. In end-of-the-century London, Samuel Butler complained that there is a photographer in every bush, going about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. The photographer is now charging real beasts, beleaguered and too rare to kill. Guns have metamorphosed into cameras, and this earnest comedy, the ecological safari, because nature has ceased to be what it had always been, what people needed protection from. Now nature, tamed, endangered, mortal, needs to be protected from people. When we are afraid, we shoot. When we are nostalgic, we take pictures. Oh my God. Let me read that sentence again. When we are afraid, we shoot. But when we are nostalgic, we take pictures. It is a nostalgic time right now, and photographs actively promote nostalgia. Photography is an elegiac art, a twilight art. Most subjects photographed are, just by virtue of being photographed, touched with pathos. An ugly or grotesque subject may be moving because it has been dignified by the attention of the photographer. A beautiful subject can be the object of rueful feelings because it has aged or decayed or no longer exists. All photographs are memento mori. To take a photograph is to participate in another person or thing's mortality, vulnerability, mutability. Precisely by slicing out this moment and freezing it, all photographs testify to time's relentless melt. Cameras began duplicating the world at that moment when the human landscape started to undergo a vertiginous rate of change. While an untold number of forms of biological and social life are being destroyed in a brief span of time, a device is available to record what is disappearing. The moody, intricately textured Paris of Atget and Versailles is mostly gone. Like the dead relatives and friends preserved in the family album, whose presence in photographs exercises some of the anxiety and remorse prompted by their disappearance. So the photographs of neighborhoods now torn down, rural places disfigured and made barren, supply our pocket relation to the past. A photograph is both a pseudo-presence and a token of absence. Like a wood fire in a room, photographs, especially those of people, of distant landscapes and faraway cities, of the vanished past are incitements to reverie. The sense of the unattainable that can be evoked by photographs feeds directly into the erotic feelings of those for whom desirability is enhanced by distance. The lover's photograph hidden in a married woman's wallet, the poster photograph of a rock star tacked up over an adolescent's bed, the campaign button of a politician's face pinned on a voter's coat, the snapshot of a cab driver's children clipped to the visor. All such talismanic uses of photographs express a feeling both sentimental and implicitly magical. They are attempts to contact or lay claim to another reality. Ooh! Yeah. Photographs can abet desire in the most direct, utilitarian way, as when someone collects photographs of anonymous examples of the desirable as an aid to. The matter is more complex when photographs are used to stimulate the moral impulse. Desire has no history. At least, it is experienced in each instance as all foreground, immediacy. It is aroused by archetypes and is in that sense abstract. But moral feelings are embedded in history, whose personae are concrete, whose situations are always specific. Thus, almost opposite rules hold true for the use of the photograph to awaken desire and awaken conscience. The images that mobilize conscience are always linked to a given historical situation. The more general they are, the less likely they are to be effective. A photograph that brings news of some unsuspected zone of misery cannot make a dent in public opinion unless there is an appropriate context of feeling and attitude. The photographs Matthew Brady and his colleagues took of the horrors of the battlefield did not make people any less keen to go on with the Civil War. The photographs of ill-clad, skeletal prisoners at Andersonville inflamed Northern public opinion against the South. The effect of the Andersonville photographs must have been partly due to the very novelty, at the time, of seeing photographs. The political understanding that many Americans came to in the 1960s would allow them, looking at the photographs Dorothea Lange took of Nisei on the West Coast being transported to internment camps in 1942, to recognize their subject for what it was, a crime committed by the government against a large group of American citizens. Few people who saw those photographs in the 1940s could have had so unequivocal a reaction. The grounds for such a judgment were covered over by the pro-war consensus. Photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one, and can help build a nascent one. Photographs may be more memorable than moving images, because they are a neat slice of time, not a flow. Television is a stream of underselected images, each of which cancels its predecessor. Each still photograph is a privileged moment, turned into a slim object that one can keep and look at again. Photographs like the one that made the front page of most newspapers in the world in 1972. A naked South Vietnamese child just sprayed by American napalm probably did more to increase the public revulsion against the war than 100 hours of televised barbarities. One would like to imagine that the American public would not have so unanimous in its acquiescence to the Korean War if it had been confronted with photographic evidence of the devastation of Korea. An ecocide and genocide in some respects even more thorough than those inflicted on Vietnam a decade later. But the supposition is trivial. The public did not see such photographs because there was, ideologically, no space for them. No one brought back photographs of daily life in Pyongyang to show that the enemy had a human face, as Felix Green and Mark Raboud brought back photographs of Hanoi. Americans did have access to photographs of the suffering of the Vietnamese, many of which came from military sources and were taken with quite a different use in mind. Because journalists felt backed in their efforts to obtain those photographs, the event having been defined by a significant number of people as a savage colonialist war. The Korean War was understood differently, as part of the just struggle of the free world against the Soviet Union and China, and given that characterization, photographs of the cruelty of unlimited American firepower would have been irrelevant. Though an event has come to mean precisely something worth photographing, it is still ideology in the broadest sense that determines what constitutes an event. There can be no evidence, photographic or otherwise, of an event until the event itself has been named and characterized. It is never photographic evidence which can construct, more properly identify, events. The contribution of photography always follows the naming of the event. What determines the possibility of being affected morally by photographs is the existence of a relevant political consciousness. Without politics, photographs of the slaughter bench of history will most likely be experienced as simply unreal, or as a demoralizing emotional blow. The quality of feeling, including moral outrage, that people can muster in response to photographs of the oppressed, the exploited, the starving, and the massacred, also depends on the degree of their familiarity with these images. Don McCullen's photographs of emaciated Biafrans in the early 1970s had less impact for some people than Werner Bischoff's photographs of Indian famine victims in the early 1950s, because those images had become banal. and the photographs of Tuareg families dying of starvation in sub-Sahara that appeared in magazines everywhere in 1973 must have seemed to many like an unbearable replay of a now familiar atrocity exhibition. Photographs shock insofar as they show something novel. Unfortunately, the ante keeps getting raised, partly through the very proliferation of such images of horror. One's first encounter with the photographic inventory of the ultimate horror is a kind of revelation, the prototypically modern revelation, a negative epiphany. For me, it was the photographs of Bergen-Belsen and Shaw, which I came across by chance in a bookstore in Santa Monica in July 1945. Nothing I have seen, in photographs or in real life, ever cut me as sharply, deeply, instantaneously. Indeed, it seems plausible to me to divide my life into two parts. Before I saw those images, I was 12, and after, though it was several years before I fully understood what they were about. What good was served by seeing them? They were only photographs of an event I had scarcely heard of and could do nothing to affect, of suffering I could hardly imagine, could do nothing to relieve. When I looked at those photographs, something broke. Some limit had been reached, and not only of that horror, I felt irrevocably grieved, wounded, but a part of my feelings started to tighten. Something went dead, something is still crying. To suffer is one thing. Another thing is living with the photographed images of suffering, which does not necessarily strengthen conscience and the ability to be compassionate. It can also corrupt them. Once one has seen such images, one has started down the road of seeing more and more. Images transfix. Images anesthetize. An event known through photographs certainly becomes more real than it would have been if one had never seen the photographs. Think of the Vietnam War. For a counterexample, think of the Gulag Archipelago, of which we have no photographs. But after repeated exposure to images, it also becomes less real. The same law holds for evil as for pornography. The shock of photographed atrocities wears off with repeated viewings, just as the surprise and bemusement felt for the first time one sees a pornographic movie wear off after one sees a few more. The sense of taboo, which makes us indignant and sorrowful, is not much sturdier than the sense of taboo that regulates the definition of what is obscene, and both have been sorely tried in recent years. The vast photographic catalogue of misery and injustice throughout the world has given everyone a certain familiarity with atrocity, making the horrible seem more ordinary, making it appear familiar, remote. It's only a photograph. Inevitable. At the time of the first photographs of the Nazi camps, there was nothing banal about these images. After 30 years, a saturation point may have been reached. In these last decades, concerned photography has done at least as much to deaden conscience as it has been to arouse it. The ethical content of photographs is fragile. With the possible exception of photographs of those horrors, like the Nazi camps, that have gained the status of ethical reference points, most photographs do not keep their emotional charge. A photograph of 1900 that was affecting then because of its subject would today be more likely to move us because it is a photograph taken in 1900. The particular qualities and intentions of photographs tend to be swallowed up in the generalized pathos of time past. Aesthetic distance seems built into the very experience of looking at photographs, if not right away, then certainly with the passage of time. Time eventually positions most photographs, even the most amateurish, at the level of art. The industrialization of photography permitted its rapid absorption into rational, that is, bureaucratic ways of running society. No longer toy images, photographs became part of the general furniture of the environment, touchstones and confirmations of that reductive approach to reality which is considered realistic. Photographs were enrolled in the service of important institutions of control, notably the family and the police, as symbolic objects and as pieces of information. Thus, in the bureaucratic cataloging of the world, many important documents are not valid unless they have affixed to them a photographed token of the citizen's face. The realistic view of the world compatible with bureaucracy redefines knowledge as techniques and information. Photographs are valued because they give information. They tell one what there is. They make an inventory. To spies, meteorologists, coroners, archaeologists, and other information professionals, their value is inestimable. But in the situations in which most people use photographs, their value as information is of the same order as fiction. The information that photographs can give starts to seem very important at that moment in cultural history when everyone is thought to have a right to something called news. Photographs were seen as a way of giving information to people who do not take easily to reading. The Daily News still calls itself New York's picture newspaper, its bid for populist identity. At the opposite end of the scale, Le Monde, a newspaper designed for skilled, well-informed readers, runs no photographs at all. The presumption is that, for such readers, a photograph could only illustrate the analysis contained in an article. A new sense of the notion of information has been constructed around the photographic image. The photograph is a thin slice of space as well as time. In a world ruled by photographic images, all borders, framing, seem arbitrary. Anything can be separated, can be made discontinuous from anything else. All that is necessary is to frame the subject differently. Conversely, anything can be made adjacent to anything else, as the number of photographs that could be taken of anything is unlimited. Through photographs, the world becomes a series of unrelated, freestanding particles, and history, past and present, a set of anecdotes and faits divers. The camera makes reality atomic, manageable, and opaque. It is a view of the world which denies interconnectedness, continuity, but which confers on each moment the character of a mystery. Any photograph has multiple meanings. Indeed, to see something in the form of a photograph is to encounter a potential object of fascination. The ultimate wisdom of the photographic image is to say, there is the surface. Now think, or rather feel, intuit, what is beyond it, what the reality must be like if it looks this way. Photographs, which cannot themselves explain anything, are inexhaustible invitations to deduction, speculation, and fantasy. Photography implies that we know about the world if we accept it as the camera records it. But this is the opposite of understanding, which starts from not accepting the world as it looks. All possibility of understanding is rooted in the ability to say no. Strictly speaking, one never understands anything from a photograph. Of course, photographs fill in blanks in our mental pictures of the present and the past. For example, Jacob Riis's image of New York squalor in the 1880s are sharply instructive to those unaware that urban poverty in the late 19th century America was really that Dickensian. Nevertheless, the camera's rendering of reality must always hide more than it discloses. As Brecht points out, a photograph of the Krupp works reveals virtually nothing about that organization. In contrast to the amorous relation, which is based on how something looks, understanding is based on how it functions. And functioning takes place in time and must be explained in time. Only that which narrates can make us understand. The limit of photographic knowledge of the world is that, while it can goad conscience, it can finally never be ethical or political knowledge. The knowledge gained through still photographs always be some kind of sentimentalism, whether cynical or humanist. It will be a knowledge at bargain prices, a semblance of knowledge, a semblance of wisdom, as the act of taking pictures is a semblance of appropriation, a semblance of rape. The very muteness of what is hypothetically comprehensible in photographs is what constitutes their attraction, provocativeness. The omnipresence of photographs has an incalculable effect on our ethical sensibility. By furnishing this already crowded world with a duplicate one of images, photography makes us feel that the world is more available than it really is. Needing to have reality confirmed and experience enhanced by photographs is an aesthetic consumerism to which everyone is now addicted. It's that, yeah. Industrial societies turn their citizens into image junkies. It is the most irresistible form of mental pollution. Poignant longings for beauty, for an end to probing below the surface, for a redemption and celebration of the body of the world. All these elements of erotic feeling are affirmed in the pleasure we take in photographs. But other, less liberating feelings are expressed as well. It would not be wrong to speak of people having a compulsion to photograph, to turn experience itself into a way of seeing. Ultimately, having an experience becomes identical with taking a photograph of it. And participating in a public event comes more and more to be the equivalent to looking at it in its photographed form. That most logical of 19th century aesthetes, Mallarmé, said that everything in the world exists in order to end in a book. Today, everything exists to end in a photograph. Thanks for joining me.